In this episode, I'm going to talk about the general concept of memoization, how to use the memoize function in Lodash, and when to use it. According to trusty old Wikipedia, memoization is an optimization technique primarily used to speed up computer programs by storing the results of expensive function calls and returning the cached result when the same inputs occur again. So it's a function with an integrated cache, and if you run this function with the same input parameters more than once, then you will get the cached result instead of a re-evaluated result that would take much longer, which is especially useful if you have very expensive functions, and therefore you save a lot of time. In the Lodash world, this is done by calling the memoize function. We pass it a random function as its first parameter, and then it returns a memoized version of this function as its return value. So this memoized version of the function is now capable of doing the things that I've talked about before. So it has this integrated cache and now will return the cached value if it has been called more than once with the same input parameters. To put our new learned knowledge into practice, I've built a little application that fetches cat images and shows them here on the right side. So why do we have to do this? The answer is we need a function that is very slow, and therefore I've built a very slow request. And because fetching the image from the original API wasn't slow enough, I had to wrap a set timeout around the whole function, but that's just a lot of details. We just have to know that the here fetch slow cat function, this one, is just very slow and takes at least 2 seconds to return us a URL for a cat. Alright, so what I do here is I push the URL for the cat that I fetched into an images array, and then the images array gets displayed by view. But again, these are details. These are not content of this tutorial. So all you have to know is that by pushing the URL to the images array, it gets displayed on the website. All right. And now, let's see. If I reload this page, you will see it will take at least 2 seconds to fetch this cat. All right, now it is here. Let's try something else. Let's try to display 5 cats by fetching all of these. Let's do this. Let's reload. And what you will see is that this will take 2 seconds for the first cat, another 2 seconds for the second cat, and another 2 seconds for the third cat. So it just takes a while. So what we can now do is make this fetch slow cat function a memoized function. Let's do this. It's memoized fetch slow cat. And now let's use memoize from Lodash and pass the fetch slow cat into the memoize function. And now memoize fetch slow cat works like fetch slow cat, but it has the behavior of a memoized function. So now we'll replace all the fetch slow cat with memoized fetch slow cat, reload the page, and we will see that all the cats load at the same time. Spectacular. What we haven't talked about yet is the second parameter of the memoize function. It's the resolver. And the resolver is used to customize the hash key of the memoize function. So by default, Lodash uses the first argument of your supposed to be memoized function as the hash key, and if you want to change this behavior, you have to pass in a resolver function. You can do many things with this. For example, you can invalidate the cache after a certain time. For example, here in this example that you can find in the Codesandbox that I have put into the video description, there I use the time and date to create a cache key that will live not longer than 10 seconds. And down here I am using the first and the second argument to create the cache key. So when would this resolver be useful? The resolver args. It's useful if you have more than one argument, for example. So if we take a look at our fetch slow cat function and add a second argument, in this case I would add the argument add-on. And now let's fetch our cat image by combining these two arguments to a unified ID. So if I pass 1 and 2 to fetch slow cat, we are going to fetch cat number 12. Now let's go down here and call our function with the new arguments, and this time we are passing in strings, so like this. Now we are fetching cat number 95 and cat number 94, but in my browser I see the same cat twice, and that is because the memoized function only looks at the first argument, and therefore it thinks we have 2 times the same call, and that's not correct. At least that's not what we want, I guess. So what we have to do is write our little own resolver that looks at both arguments and then creates a hash key, and then it should work. So I already did that. I just combined the first argument and the second argument that's being passed in, and now just pass in the resolver as the second parameter of the memoize function. And now everything is fetched correctly. All right. Now the question comes to mind, why don't we just memoize every single function so we get to insane speed? But the problem is this memoization process also has a downside, and it's connected to the caching of the values. So if your function that you're trying to memoize isn't idempotent, meaning it does not always return the same value for the same inputs, then you're going to be confronted with stale values or old values that do not really represent what the function should have calculated. In conclusion, one could say that it is most useful to use memoize if the function you are passing to memoize is idempotent, and therefore the function is very predictable. If the function does not have these properties, then memoize only makes sense if you are actively invalidating the cache of the memoize function, or if it doesn't really matter that the values that you get are stale. But otherwise I would go for the before mentioned reasoning. I hope you got some value from this video. If you have any feedback, leave it down in the comments. Yeah, that's basically it. If you want to see more of this, you can subscribe and do all the funny stuff. And see you again soon.